Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to be continuing with my Read Aloud series, and I will be continuing to read aloud the book City of Fallen Angels by Cassandra Clare. So previously we read chapter 1, now we're going to be reading chapter 2, which is called Falling. But before we begin, I just have to put the quick disclaimer out there that I don't own any of the text being presented here. All of the text belongs to Cassandra Clare. This is just simply a read aloud that I'm doing on this channel for entertainment purposes, and everything is in fair use. So, this is chapter 2, Falling. So, did you have fun with Isabel tonight? Clary, her phone jammed against her ear, maneuvered herself carefully from one long beam to another. The beams were set 20 feet up in the rafters of the Institute's attic, where the training room was located. Walking the beams was meant to teach you how to balance. Clary hated them. Her fear of heights made the whole business sickening, despite the flexible cord tied around her waist that was supposed to keep her from hitting the floor if she fell. Have you told her about Maya yet? Simon made a faint, non-committal noise that Clary knew meant no. She could hear music in the background. She could picture him lying on his bed, the stereo playing softly as he talked to her. He sounded tired, that sort of bone-deep tired she knew meant that his light tone didn't reflect his mood. She'd asked him if he was all right several times at the beginning of the conversation, but he'd brushed away her concern. She snorted. "You're playing with fire, Simon. I hope you know that." "I don't know. Do you really think it's such a big deal?" Simon sounded plaintive. "I haven't had a single conversation with Isabel or Maya about dating exclusively. Let me tell you something about girls." Clary sat down on a beam, letting her legs dangle out into the air. The attic's half-moon windows were open, and cool night air spilled in, chilling her sweaty skin. She had always thought the shadow hunters trained in their tough, leather-like gear, but as it turned out, that was for later training, which involved weapons. For the sort of training she was doing, exercises meant to increase her flexibility, speed, and sense of balance. She wore a light tank top and drawstring pants that reminded her of medical scrubs. Even if you haven't had the exclusivity conversation, they're still going to be mad if they find out you're dating someone they know and you haven't mentioned it. It's a dating rule. Well, how am I supposed to know that rule? Everyone knows that rule. I thought you were supposed to be on my side. I am on your side. So why aren't you being more sympathetic? Clary switched the phone to her other ear and peered down into the shadows below her. Where was Jace? He'd gone to get another robe and said he'd be back in 5 minutes. Of course, if he caught her on the phone up here, he'd probably kill her. He was rarely in charge of her training. That was usually Maris, Kadir, or various other members of the New York conclave, pinch-hitting until a replacement for the Institute's previous tutor, Hodge, could be found. But when he was, he took it very seriously. "Because," she said, "your problems are not real problems. You're dating 2 beautiful girls at once. Think about it. That's like rock star problems. Having rock star problems may be the closest I ever get to being an actual rock star. No one told you to call your band Silicious Mold, my friend. We're Millennium Lint now," Simon protested. "Look, just figure this out before the wedding. If they both think you're going to it with you and they find out at the wedding that you're dating them both, they'll kill you." She stood up. "And then my mom's wedding will be ruined, and she'll kill you, so you'll be dead twice. Well, 3 times, technically. I never told either of them I was going to the wedding with them." Simon sounded panicked. "Yes, but they're going to expect you to. That's why girls have boyfriends, so you have someone to take you to boring functions." Clary moved out to the edge of the beam, looking down into the witchlight-illuminated shadows below. There was an old training circle chalked on the floor. It looked like a bullseye. "Anyway, I have to jump off this beam now and possibly hurtle to my death. To my horrible death. I'll talk to you tomorrow. I've got band practice at 2, remember? I'll see you there. See you." She hung up and stuck the phone into her bra. The light training clothes didn't have any pockets. So what was a girl to do? "So, are you planning to stay up there all night?" Jace stepped into the center of the bullseye and looked up at her. He was wearing fighting gear, not training clothes like Clary was, and his fair hair stood out startlingly against the black. It had darkened slightly since the end of summer and was more a dark gold than light, which Clary thought suited him even better. It made her absurdly happy that she had known him long enough to notice small changes in his appearance. "I thought you were coming up here," she called down. "Change of plans?" "Long story." He grinned up at her. "So, you want to practice flips?" Clary sighed. Practicing flips involved flinging herself off the beam into empty space and using the flexible cord to hold her while she pushed off the walls and flipped herself over and under, teaching herself to whirl, kick, and duck without worrying about hard floors and bruises. She'd seen Jace do it, and he looked like a falling angel while he did, flying through the air, whirling and spinning with beautiful balletic grace. She, on the other hand, crawled up like a potato bug as soon as the floor approached, and the fact that she intellectually knew she wasn't going to hit it didn't seem to make any difference. She was starting to wonder if it didn't matter that she'd been born a shadow hunter. Maybe it was too late for her to be made into one, or at least a fully functional one, or maybe the gift that made her and Jace what they were had been somehow distributed unequally between them. So he had gotten all the physical grace and she had gotten, well, not a lot of it. "Come on, Clary," Jace said. "Jump!" She closed her eyes and jumped. For a moment, she felt herself hung suspended, free of everything. Then gravity took over and she plunged toward the floor. Instinctively, she pulled her arms and legs in, keeping her eyes squeezed shut. The cord pulled taut and she rebounded, flying back up before falling again. As her velocity showed, she opened her eyes and found herself dangling at the end of the cord, about 5 feet above Jace. He was grinning. "Nice," he said, as graceful as a falling snowflake. "Was I screaming?" she asked, genuinely curious. "You know, on the way down?" He nodded. "Thankfully no one's home, or they would have assumed I was murdering you." "Ha! You can't even reach me!" She kicked out a leg and spun lazily in midair. Jace's eyes glinted. "Want to bet?" Clary knew that expression. "No!" she said quickly. "Whatever you're going to do." But he'd already done it. When Jace moved fast, his individual movements were almost invisible. She saw his hand go to his belt, and then something flashed in the air. She heard the sound of parting fabric as the cord above her head was sheared through. Released, she fell freely, too surprised to scream, directly into Jace's arms. The force knocked him backward, and they sprawled together onto one of the padded floor mats, Clary on top of him. He grinned up at her. "Now," he said, "that was much better. You didn't scream at all." "I didn't get the chance." She was breathless, and not just from the impact of the fall. Being sprawled on top of Jace, feeling his body against hers, made her hands shake and her heart beat faster. She had thought maybe her physical reaction to him, their reactions to each other, would fade with familiarity. But that hadn't happened. If anything, it had gotten worse the more time she'd spent with him. Or better, she supposed, depending on how you thought about it. He was looking up at her with dark, golden eyes. She wondered if their color had intensified since his encounter with Raziel, the angel, by the shores of Lake Lynn and Idris. She couldn't ask anyone, though everyone knew that Valentine had summoned the angel, and that the angel had healed Jace from injuries Valentine had inflicted on him. No one but Clary and Jace knew that Valentine had done more than just injure his adopted son. He had stabbed Jace through the heart as part of the summoning ceremony, stabbed him and held him while he died. At Clary's wish, Raziel had brought Jace back from death. The enormity of it still shocked Clary, and she suspected Jace as well. They had agreed never to tell anyone, and that Jace had actually died, even for a brief time. It was their secret. He reached up and pushed her hair back from her face. "I'm joking," he said. "You're not so bad. You'll get there. You should have seen Alec do flips at first. I think he kicked himself in the head once." "Sure," Clary said, "but he was probably 11. She eyed him. "I suppose you've always been amazing at this stuff?" "I was born amazing." He stroked her cheek with the tips of his fingers, lightly but enough to make her shiver. She said nothing. He was joking, but in a sense it was true. Jace had been born to be what he was. "So, how long can you stay tonight?" She smiled a little. Are we done with training? I'd like to think that we're done with the part of the evening where it's absolutely required. Although there are a few things I'd like to practice." He reached up to pull her down, but at that moment the door opened and Isabel came stalking in, the high heels of her boots clicking on the polished hardwood floor. Catching sight of Jason and Clary sprawled on the floor, she raised her eyebrows. Canoodling, I see. I thought you were supposed to be training. No one said you had to walk in without knocking, Jace didn't move, just turned his head to the side to look at Isabel with a mixture of annoyance and affection. Clary, though, scrambled to her feet, straightening her crumpled clothes. It's the training room. It's public space. Isabel was pulling off one of her gloves, which were bright red velvet. I just got these at Trash and Vaudeville, on sale. Don't you love them? Don't you wish you had a pair? She wiggled her fingers in their direction. I don't know, said Jace. I think they'd clash with my gear. Isabel made a face at him. Did you hear about the dead shadow hunter they found in Brooklyn? The body was all mingled up, so they don't know who it is yet. I assume that's where Mom went. Yeah, said Jace, sitting up. Clave meeting. I ran into her on the way out. You didn't tell me that, said Clary. Is that why you took so long getting rope? He nodded. Sorry, I didn't want to freak you out. He means, said Isabel, he didn't want to spoil the romantic mood. She bit her lip. I just hope it wasn't anyone we know. I don't think it could have been. The body was dumped in an abandoned factory. Had been there for several days. If it had been someone we knew, we would have noticed they were missing. Jace pushed his hair back behind his ears. He was looking at Isabel a little impatiently, Clary thought, as if he were annoyed she'd brought this up. She wished he told her earlier, even if it would have spoiled the mood. Much of what they all did, Clary knew, brought them into infrequent contact with the reality of death. All the Lightwoods were, in their own ways, still grieving the loss of the youngest son, Max, who had died simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was strange. Jace had accepted her decision to leave high school and take up training without a murmur, but he shied away from discussing the dangers of a shadow-hunting life with her. I'm going to get dressed, she announced, and headed for the door that led to the small changing room attached to the training area. It was very plain. Pale wood walls, a mirror, a shower, and hooks for clothes. Towels were stacked neatly on a wooden bench by the door. Clary showered quickly and put on her street clothes, tights, boots, jean skirt, and a new pink sweater. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw that there was a hole in her tights, and her damp and curling red hair was an untidy tangle. She would never look perfectly put together like Isabel always did, but Jace didn't seem to mind. By the time she came back to the training room, Isabel and Jace had left the topic of dead shadow hunters behind and had moved on to something Jace apparently found even more horrifying. Isabel's date with Simon. I can't believe he took you to an actual restaurant. Jace was on his feet now, putting away the floor mats and training gear, while Isabel leaned against the wall and played with her new gloves. I assumed this idea of a date would be making you watch him play World of Warcraft with his nerd friends. I, Clary pointed out, am one of his nerd friends, thank you. Jace grinned at her. It wasn't really a restaurant, more of a diner, with pink soup that he wanted me to try, Isabel said thoughtfully. He was very sweet. Clary felt instantly guilty for not telling her or Jace about Maya. He said you had fun. Isabel's gaze flickered over to her. There was a peculiar quality to Isabel's expression, as if she were hiding something, but it was gone before Clary could be sure it happened there at all. You talked to him? Yeah, he called me a few minutes ago, just to check in. Clary shrugged. I see, Isabel said, her voice suddenly brisk and cool. Well, as I said, he's very sweet, but maybe a bit too sweet. That can be boring. She stuffed her gloves into her pockets. Anyway, it isn't a permanent thing. It's just playing around for now. Clary's guilt faded. Have you guys ever talked about, dating exclusively? Isabel looked horrified. Of course not. She yawned then, stretching her arms cat-like over her head. Okay, off to bed. See you later, lovebirds. She departed, leaving a hazy cloud of jasmine perfume in her wake. Jace looked over at Clary. He had started unbuckling his gear, which clasped at the wrists and back, forming a protective shell over his clothes. I suppose you have to go home? She nodded reluctantly. Getting her mother to agree to let her pursue Shadowhunter training had been a long, unpleasant argument in the first place. Jocelyn had dug her heels in, saying that she'd spent her life trying to keep Clary out of the Shadowhunter culture, which she saw as dangerous. Not just violent, she argued, but isolationist and cruel. Only a year ago, she pointed out to Clary, Clary's decision to be trained as a shadow hunter would have meant she could never speak to her mother again. Clary argued back that the fact that the Clave had suspended rules like that while the new council reviewed the laws meant that the Clave had changed since Jocelyn had been a girl. And anyway, Clary needed to know how to defend herself. I hope this isn't just because of Jace, Jocelyn had said finally. I know how it is when you're in love with someone. You want to be where they are and do what they do, but Clary, I am not you, Clary had said, struggling to control her anger. The Shadowhunters aren't the Circle, and Jace isn't Valentine. I didn't say anything about Valentine. It's what you were thinking, Clary had said. Maybe Valentine brought Jace up, but Jace isn't anything like him. Well, I hope not, Jocelyn had said softly, for all our sakes. Eventually she had given in, but with some rules. Clary wasn't to live in the Institute, but with her mother at Luke's. Jocelyn got weekly progress reports from Maris to assure her that Clary was learning, and not just, Clary supposed, ogling Jace all day, or whatever she was worried about. And Clary wasn't to spend the night at the Institute. Ever. No sleepovers where your boyfriend lives, Jocelyn had said firmly. I don't care if it is the Institute. No. Boyfriend. It was still a shock, hearing the word. For so long, it had seemed a total impossibility that Jace would ever be her boyfriend, that they could ever be anything to each other at all but brother and sister, and that had been too hard and horrible to face. Never seeing each other again, they had decided, would have been better than that, and that would have been like dying. And then, by a miracle, they had been set free. Now it had been 6 weeks, but Clary wasn't tired of the word yet. I have to get home, she said. It's almost 11, and my mom freaks if I stay here past 10. All right. Jace dropped his gear, or at least the top half of it, onto the bench. He wore a thin t-shirt underneath. Clary could see his marks through it, like ink bleeding through wet paper. I'll walk you out. The Institute was quiet as they passed through. There were no visiting shadow hunters from other cities staying right now. Robert, Isabel and Alec's father, was in Idris, helping set up the new council. And with Hodge and Max gone forever, and Alec away with Magnus, Clary felt as if the remaining occupants were like guests in a mostly empty hotel. She wished other members of the conclave would come around more often, but she supposed everyone was giving the Lightwoods time at the moment. Time to remember Max, and time to forget. So have you heard from Alec and Magnus lately? She asked. Are they having a good time? Sounds like it. Jace took his phone out of his pocket and handed it to her. Alec keeps sending me annoying photos. Lots of captions like, wish you were here, except not really. Well, you can't blame him. It's supposed to be a romantic vacation. She flipped through the photos on Jace's phone and giggled. Alec and Magnus standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Alec wearing jeans as usual, and Magnus wearing a striped fisherman's sweater, leather pants, and an insane beret. In the Bobolde Gardens, Alec was still wearing jeans, and Magnus was wearing an enormous Venetian cloak and a gondolier's hat. He looks like the Phantom of the Opera. In front of the Prado, he was wearing a sparkling Meditator jacket and platform boots, while Alec appeared to be calmly feeding a pigeon in the background. I'm taking that away from you before you get to the India part, said Jace, retrieving his phone. Magnus and a sorry. Some things you don't ever forget. Clary laughed. They had already reached the elevator, which opened its rattling gate when Jace pushed the call button. She stepped inside, and Jace followed her. The moment the elevator started down, Clary didn't think she'd ever get used to the initial heart-stopping lurch as it began its descent. He moved toward Clary in the dimness and drew her close. She put her hands against his chest, feeling the hard muscles under his t-shirt, the beat of his heart beneath them. In the shadowy light, his eyes shone. I'm sorry I can't stay, she whispered. Don't be. There was a ragged edge to his voice that surprised her. Jocelyn doesn't want you to turn out like me. I don't blame her for that. Jace, she said, a little bewildered by the bitterness in his voice. Are you all right? Instead of answering, he kissed her, pulling her hard against him. His body pressed hers against the wall, the metal of the mirror cold against her back, his hands sliding around her waist, up under her sweater. She always loved the way he held her, careful but not too gentle. Not so gentle that she ever felt he was more in control than she was. Neither of them could control how they felt about each other, and she liked that. Liked the way his heart hammered against hers. Liked the way he murmured against her mouth when she kissed him back. The elevator came to a rattling stop. Beyond it, she could see the empty nave of the cathedral, light shimmering in a line of candelabras down the center aisle. She clung to Jace, glad there was very little light in the elevator so she couldn't see her own burning face in the mirror. "Maybe I can stay," she whispered. "Just a little while longer." He said nothing. She whispered, "Just a little while longer." He said nothing. She could feel the tension in him and tensed herself. It was more than just the tension of desire. He was shaking, his whole body trembling as he buried his face in the crook of her neck. "Jace," she said. He let go of her then, suddenly, and stepped back. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes fever red. "No," he said. "I don't want to give your mother another reason not to like me. She already thinks I'm the second coming of my father." He broke off before Clary could say, "Valentine wasn't your father." Jace was usually so careful to refer to Valentine Morgenstern by name, never as "my father," when he mentioned Valentine at all. Usually they stayed away from the topic, and Clary had never admitted to Jace that her mother worried that he was secretly just like Valentine, knowing that even the suggestion would hurt him badly. Mostly, Clary just did everything she could to keep the two of them apart. He reached past her before he could say anything and yanked open the elevator door. "I love you, Clary," he said without looking at her. He was staring out into the church at the rows of lighted candles, their gold reflected in his eyes. "More than I ever," he broke off. "God, more than I probably should. You know that, don't you?" She stepped outside the elevator and turned to face him. There were 1,000 things she wanted to say, but he was already looking away from her, pushing the button that would bring the elevator back up to the Institute floors. She started to protest, but the elevator was already moving, the doors closing as it rattled its way back up. They shut with a click, and she stared at them for a moment. The angel was painted on their surface, wings outspread, eyes raised. The angel was painted on everything. Her voice echoed harshly in the empty room when she spoke. "I love you too," she said. Okay, so that is a slightly shorter chapter. As you see, it only took me like 20 minutes. But here's the whole thing with this one, is that this is the beginning of Jace starting to beat himself up. This is the beginning of his downward spiral that happens throughout this book. You can already feel that there is some sort of a distance, but yet they can hardly keep their hands off of each other. And I think that that is what makes this chapter very interesting, is that the way how they just can't stop. You know, the fact that Clary notes like how deeply they're kissing and how, you know, they just don't want to be apart. And then Jace moves into that whole spiel about comparing himself to Valentine and how he thinks he's somehow like Valentine because at this point we don't know yet, but I know because I read this book already. I watched season 3 Shadowhunters. I know that Jace is thinking that there's something seriously wrong with him, even though he doesn't have demon blood. There's still a part of him that cannot separate the fact that Valentine had raised him. He cannot separate himself from Valentine, even though he knows somehow deep down that he isn't like Valentine, but he still thinks that there is a part of him that is like his adoptive father. And you see that quite a bit, especially in season 3 of Shadowhunters, where you see those flashes. Like, I went over this in the Life of Jace Herondale video that I posted on my channel a while ago when I was first starting to read the books, and obviously, you know, I got some pretty major inconsistencies in there, such as Simon's ascension and all that, but those little minute details almost mean nothing when you look at the bigger picture that Jace really, really struggles with his identity throughout these books. He really does go through an identity crisis throughout the entire series, because first he learns, oh my gosh, Valentine was actually the man that raised me. He disguised himself as Michael Wayland, pretended to be somebody who died during the uprising, pretended to be a father figure to me, raised me, abused me, physically beat me, and then I find out, oh my god, like, he's not my biological dad, he was lying, and then all of a sudden it all comes into fruition that he has angel blood, that he wasn't injected with Lilith's blood, that it was Sebastian who had that happen to him, that he and Sebastian were two sides of the same experiment. And then by the time you get to this stuff, which is like season 3 details, obviously, if you ever saw season 3 of Shadowhunters, you see how badly Jace kind of suffers. They visualize it quite well on screen, but in my opinion, the book is better, because when you read it, you're like, oh my gosh, you're really seeing how Jace is starting to distance himself from Clary. Just when they are at this point where they acknowledge that they're not brother and sister and that they're able to be together, but yet when they're together, it's like he wants to be away from her, and Clary cannot understand why that is. And now all of a sudden there's something about a dead shadow hunter being found in an abandoned factory, and I believe that is tied to Jace. I could be wrong, I don't know, but I think it's because of Lilith's influence on Jace. But again, my memory is kind of fuzzy of this entire book, so obviously my memory is going to be refreshed when I read it again, because obviously the books themselves are so detailed, you don't even know where to look first. I think that's something that Cassandra Clare and Rick Riordan actually have in common, because truthfully, you know, they shove so much detail in there, especially with Clary's rune ability, her gift to create her own runes, to bend things to her will, to basically be the creator, which is her tarot card. Her tarot card is the creator, more or less. Basically so much information gets shoved at you that you can barely process what had happened first. She and Rick Riordan have that similarity in the way that they write, and if I tried, I think, reading this at the age of 14, I would not have understood what was going on. But as reading it as an adult, it's definitely interesting, because like they reference the Old Testament a lot, because Cassie is Jewish. She was raised in a Jewish household, so obviously her knowledge of the Old Testament, and there being biblical verses from the Old Testament, even the New Testament stuff from Paradise Lost by Milton, is referenced all the time. She's always referencing Paradise Lost over and over and over again, because Paradise Lost is really about the fall of Lucifer. It's about Adam and Eve falling from grace in the Garden of Eden, and truthfully, you see that a lot in this book. I definitely see a lot of influence from John Milton's epic poem in this book, and it's said to be one of the hardest poems that you could ever read. But the thing is that with John Milton's Paradise Lost, you really do see how Adam and Eve sort of fell from grace, and that sort of references and sort of emulates Jace's fall from grace by the end of this book. And I'm not going to fully give away everything that happened, but you know what? You're going to know. If you watch my Life of Jace Herondale video, if you watch any of my Life of videos about the Mortal Instruments characters that I've posted onto the channel so far, you're going to know all the spoilers. So obviously, you know, that was chapter 2, Falling, because truthfully, it's not just a reference to Clary falling from the beams in the training room in the attic. It's also a reference to the fact that her and Jace are starting to kind of have a little bit of a falling out, and that there's truly some trouble in paradise for the two of them. So that's all I have for today. So if you enjoyed the read aloud, you can subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Also be sure to leave comments down below and let me know your thoughts and opinions on the chapter itself and what references you were able to pick up from just listening to chapter 2. And then we're going to continue at some point with chapter 3, which is called Sevenfold. And truthfully, I'm actually really excited as we go along, because this is the book that truly, I think, develops the friendship a lot between Simon and Jace. And you're going to see a lot of that. And you're going to see a lot of shades of Alberto Rosende and Dom Sherwood happening throughout this book as they kind of develop a little bit of a bromance. And of course, I still say that I personally like Jamie Campbell Bower's Jace better than Dominic Sherwood's. Dominic Sherwood, I mean, he's great and all, but Jamie Campbell Bower, I think, was a hotter Jace, and he was a little bit cockier. He was definitely smoother in the way that he delivered his lines throughout the movie. That's all I can say. Jamie Campbell Bower, he was smoother. Much smoother. Yeah, he was Jace. He was Jace in every single way that mattered. So, thank you for watching, and have a good day, guys. Take care.